I'm talking here about mind-matter interaction experiments with light. Some of what I'm going to say is a recapitulation of the two talks that you just heard. There shall be pictures of cats, but only 2 pictures of cats. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. First of all, a mystery in physics, interpretations of the mysteries, and then experiments involving them. The mystery, as Richard Feynman said, is absolutely impossible to explain in any classical way, and which has it at the heart of quantum mechanics. In reality, it contains the only mystery. In terms of the interpretations of this mystery, there are ideas like many worlds hypothesis, decoherence, Copenhagen interpretation, and the one that I'll focus on most is the one that was proposed by John von Neumann and presented, among other places, in his book, The Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. In terms of experiments, I'm going to talk about work that we've been doing for the last almost 7 years now. So let's look in more detail about the mystery. The mystery, of course, is the quantum measurement problem. And to talk about this in terms that everyone can understand, I'll use cows. The cows behave in a certain way, provided that there's no one watching. When somebody comes by, the cows act in a different way. And then they go back in a different way when they're not being watched anymore. So this is one of the problems, that this doesn't just happen for cows. It also happens for elementary particles, electrons, photons, and so on. The other part of the problem, or the mystery, is that photons and elementary particles can simultaneously be in 2 different states. So this is like wave particle. The skier is a particle, but can act like a wave occasionally as well. If you take golf balls and you shoot them through 2 slits, then you would expect that when you look at the other side of the screen that you'll get 2 bands of golf ball hits. And the same is true for light, provided that you're looking where each photon goes. But if you don't look, then you get this interference pattern. So this is the same thing about the cows. Whether you look or don't look, you get different kinds of distributions. So if the path is knowable, then photons behave like particles. If it's unknowable, photons behave like waves. You actually do this in the laboratory, and you use something like a double slit system with a laser. On the top, you see a particle pattern, like a single slit pattern, and the bottom is a double slit pattern, where both slits are open. That's what it looks like. So all of this has something to do with words like knowledge, information, observation, measurement. And they're related they're semantically different, but they're related in ways that we kind of grok. And we grok it in terms of this. Like we're information processing machines, kind of. And what we do involves knowledge, information, and observation. And that then becomes a link between possible mind-matter interaction. So now let's look at interpretations in a little more detail. In particular, the one by John von Neumann, he had this principle, what he called psychophysical parallelism, where consciousness collapses the quantum wave-like behavior into classical particle-like behavior. What's your opinion of the importance of the quantum measurement problem? This was asked at a conference in 2011 by Zeilinger. 33 people were present. These are all specialists in the foundations of quantum mechanics, and they gave a variety of answers. And the reason I bring this up is because sometimes physicists might say, well, the quantum measurement problem has been solved by this, or it's been solved by that. And what do the specialists say? Actually, you can see by their responses that there is no clear consensus. And the interesting response is this: it's a severe difficulty threatening our understanding of quantum mechanics. So even among specialists, there is, first of all, no consensus, no clear consensus, and also some, like a quarter of the people responding, said this is a very important problem that is not yet resolved. And then you ask the philosophers, like David Chalmers. He says that the hard problem of consciousness has already been raised. It's about subjectivity. So he proposes we might need 1 or 2 ideas that might seem crazy. His crazy idea is the same as John von Neumann's and Wigner's and others, that consciousness may be fundamental in some way that physics is not yet able to deal with. So what about experiments? The experiments that we've been doing have been looking at what we might call the observer effect. Does pure subjectivity collapse the quantum wave function or not? You would think that within physics, given that this is an outstanding problem, that there would be many, many experiments in the physics literature, and there are a couple, but with one exception, all of them are involved with people who are doing parapsychology and not physics. And here's one cat, but it's a cartoon cat. So with Schrodinger's cat paradox, what we're interested in is, can we select a preferred outcome by mental means alone? So we're going to try to select that outcome. Part of what I'm talking about here, I had mentioned in a talk at SSE a few years ago, and I'm going to go quickly through that and then bring you up to speed on the latest work. So no cats were harmed. And instead, we use a Michelson interferometer instead of a cat. So this is a very nice interferometer. You send a light beam through there through a half-silvered mirror. And so part of the beam is reflected to a solid mirror, and the other part goes through to a solid mirror. And then the two beams combine, and you get a nice interference pattern, which in this particular design comes out as a concentric circle. So there's the interference pattern. So the idea in this sort of experiment is that you have the optical apparatus inside some sealed container. In this case, it's inside our electromagnetically shielded room, which also in this case was light tight. And then outside the room, we have a person, and we tell them to put your mind in the arm of the interferometer. And we're using interferometer, this particular one in this experiment, because it's big enough so you can tell somebody it's about the size of a grapefruit. It's a big space where you need to put your mind, so it's easy to describe what to do with it. And when your mind is there, imagine you can see the photons. If you can, then you're gaining which path information out of the system, and you would so-called collapse the wave function. Their job is to gain knowledge. Some people can't do this task very well. They get confused with the idea that in their mind's eye they have to see a photon. Well, they don't know how to do that. So I said, okay, if you can't do that, imagine you can block the photons. Imagine you can move them. Imagine you can do anything with the photons. And so people figure out themselves what they're going to do. So under calibration conditions, you run the system under conditions where you ask, in this case, no one there, but you ask them to observe with your mind's eye and then rest and withdraw your attention. And now observe again, withdraw your attention for roughly 30 seconds to a minute at a time. And you see how the system behaves. It should show no change at all. And in fact, this is calibration condition. There's no change in the interference pattern. But when you ask a person to do this, under experimental conditions, the line on the bottom here is what happens when a highly experienced meditator did this task. Now, this meditator is, at the time, he was probably about 75 years old, and he said that he had been meditating about 70 years. Not continually, but enough so that he's able to go into a state which in the yogic tradition would be called a siddhi. He's able to do the special yoga superpowers, which involves manipulation of mind and matter. So he did that in this case, and we got a very good result. We ran non-meditators and meditators, partially because we expect that meditators have attention training, and this kind of experiment requires you focus attention. So we expected they would do better, and in fact, all of the action in this experiment was from the meditators. They ended up with odds against chance of about 100,000 to 1, and we published this in 2008. So as a result of that experiment, we decided to take the plunge and go to a double-slit optical system. As you see, the design is extremely simple. It's just a laser, a filter that reduces the illumination level, a double slit, and then a camera. That's what it looks like. The laser tube is on the left. It's a helium neon laser, and the double slit and the camera are inside the box in the middle. And inside the box, there's the holder for the double slit, and there's also a line camera. And so that's very simple. And the idea of this is on the top, you see the intensity level that the camera measures. It's a line camera, but what it's showing here is the intensity, and the pattern is the interference pattern. On the bottom is a Fourier transform of the picture on the top, and it shows 3 peaks. The middle peak is a double slit peak. This is the single slit peak, and the peak on the right is a harmonic of the double slit. So this is a very easy way of taking an entire pattern, doing a Fourier transform, and getting 2 points of interest, the double slit and the single slit peaks. And that allows you to basically capture the whole pattern and see how much, as I call it, double slittiness there is going on. So we used a measure of the ratio between the double slit and single slit spectral peaks, and had the prediction that when somebody was observing the system and trying to get which path knowledge out of it, that the double slit power would go down, the single slit power would go up. So the ratio should go down when the mind is in the box, so to speak. So there's a picture of what the signal actually looks like over the course of around 11 minutes. We're looking at the spectral ratio. We have assignments down here. Attention towards the box, attention away from the box. And these are automatically given by a computer to the participant in the experiment. And the bottom line is, when you look at the means of that signal and the attention away versus the attention towards, there should be a difference between them in a predictable direction. Namely, there should be less double slit power when people are attending toward the system. That's because they're gaining which path information out of the system. The signal looks like it's going all over the place, but the actual variance here is only 0.4%. This is just an expansion of it so you can see the way that the signal moves. So we did a couple of experiments. First of all, the first experiment is here. We were asking, does anything happen at all when you do this? So we had 30 sessions. People did the experiment repeatedly. The green dot, does it show up? Yeah, the green dot is all data. The red dot is meditators, and the blue dot is non-meditators. So the first experiment did pretty well. It was a modest, significant decline as we expected, as we hoped. Then we did another experiment, which is basically the same thing, because we looked at the first result and we said, really? That was really what happened? Well, so the second experiment, the overall result was basically the same. The meditators did better. The third experiment, we were concerned that maybe what we're seeing is an artifact as a result of the participants being within 2 meters of the optical system. And so we thought that because interferometers are so sensitive to everything, that maybe what was happening is that the participants were leaning forward a little bit when they're putting their mind in the box, and that would raise the temperature of the box by maybe 1,000th of a degree, and that might be enough in order to see the effect we were seeing. So we put thermocouples on the interferometer to measure the temperature changes to see if that was in fact what was going on, and the answer is it was not. That wasn't what's happening. The temperature wasn't changing at all. So overall, we get slightly smaller effect, but still in the predicted direction. The meditators did quite well, and in this case, the non-meditators didn't do well at all. We did the experiment again using a delayed choice version, and this is a little complicated to wrap your brain around, but the notion of observation in this case, it doesn't have to take place in real time. It could take place in the future. So the observation that took place in this experiment took place 2 months after the data was recorded. So the meditators did very well in this version. Overall, people did pretty well, and again, the non-meditators did not do so good. We ran 5 different control tests, which are the same apparatus, the same analysis, the same everything, under conditions where there's nobody around, just to see what the box is doing, and none of those are statistically significant. And then overall, this is what we get with the first 4 pilot studies. Meditators did extremely well. That's what the p-value there is, but even overall, people did quite well. So that encouraged us to do a formal experiment. This is a pre-planned experiment with 50 sessions where we tried to optimize the results by selecting the people who would do the experiment based on how they did in the pilot test. So we're selecting people based on what we think is a mild form of talent, and they did extremely well. So the red dot are humans, and the white dot there is a control, a matched control. When you look at the difference between the meditators and non-meditators, you can see that cumulatively the meditators actually did very well, accumulating down to about 4.5 sigma results. And the non-meditators did okay, but just they didn't get a significant result. So we published this in Physics Essays in 2012. And then we decided it's very difficult to do this experiment and get 4 or 5 sigma results and actually believe that that's what's happening. because I've done many, many experiments involving random number generators, and you don't often get results that good. So I've maintained a certain degree of suspicion about what's going on here, and we decided we have to replicate it again. And so we did it again with selected people. This time, we also concentrated on something, we're looking for other ways of seeing whether this is really what it appears to be. And so one of the effects here is that the task involves asking people to put your mind over there, and now withdraw it, and now put it back, and now withdraw it. And the machine is telling you when to do that. If you think about it, and you were asked to do that task, you'd realize you can't switch your attention that quickly. In the cognitive world, it's called task switching cost. It takes a couple of seconds to switch gears mentally. And so we figured that what should be happening in this experiment is that we should see a delay in the data, suggesting that if the people are actually taking a few seconds to change their attention, you should see that delay in the data itself. So we predicted something between 2 and 5 seconds delay, and so this is a delay analysis, or lagging from 0 seconds to minus 15 seconds. And in fact, you do see a delay. In this case, it was around 2 seconds. 2 seconds after the instruction was given, you actually get a better result. And so that's the experimental data on the top. We're looking at the control data. So the controls are not significant. The experimental data is very significant. So this we published also in Physics Essays last year. In that paper, we also did an analysis of these data using a theoretical model. You can very precisely model this using wave mechanics based on a Fraunhofer diffraction model. So there's how you characterize the model. These are what the equations look like. The equation on the bottom there is showing the intensity level that you would measure, and it has 3 components. One is the amount of light coming through one slit and one through the other slit, and then the light coming through both slits. And this allows you to partition out the contribution of light from each of the slits. The model then is on the top. You get a very nicely well-behaved and symmetrical interference pattern. And the bottom is the actual data. So the actual data is a little bit skewed. It's not a perfectly symmetrical. The Fourier transform, which is on the right, you see is not exactly the way the model would show. And the reason for this is because when you're working with a real system, there's small imperfections in it. And of course, it's very, very difficult to arrange it so it actually looks exactly like the theoretical model. But it's pretty good. So we modeled the data based on the Fraunhofer equations. And what we come up with is this. That on the top, when somebody is asked to relax and withdraw their mind from the system, the amount of light going through 2 slits is symmetrical. Total amount of light is the same going through 2 slits. That's what the model would predict. When they concentrate, though, the amount of light becomes skewed. There's more light through one slit, less light through the other, and that would produce the results that we see in this experiment. This doesn't mean that this is what's happening in this experiment, but it's consistent with what we see. So it's as though the act of observing is making the light skewed in some way. It becomes asymmetrical. For this same paper, we also decided to replicate the experiment using a completely different system. So this is a diode laser, which is designed to be extremely stable in many respects in terms of the stability of power output. It's very stable. It's temperature resistant. It's vibration resistant. It's 200-meter coherence length. It's specially designed for experiments requiring very stable outputs. And this is by contrast to a helium neon laser. If those of you who've used helium neon lasers know that it does what's called mode hopping, and that's because it's a gas tube. It's like these fluorescent tubes up here with slight arrangement that's a little bit different. But the idea is that when you have a gas tube, it gets heated up on one side. The gas inside is moving. That causes a little bit difference in power output. And also, you hope that it stays in a standing wave in its lasing mode, but there are other modes that it can be in. It could also sometimes switch so that it's like 3 lobes. And every time it switches randomly, it produces a different power output. That introduces noise into our measurement. Because if you look very carefully at the interference pattern, the total amount of power will make it actually hop up and down a little bit. And so we have to do a lot of fancy statistics in order to get rid of that. And we decided we needed a system that was stable enough so that you didn't need to use any fancy statistics at all. The system was just stable. So that's what this is about. The laser is sent, in this case, through a crystal, a quartz crystal from the place where they have quartz crystals from John of God. You can buy these crystals. So I bought that because I figured we need God's help on this, or maybe John of God's help. And the reason for it really was that we need something to diverge the beam itself. The beam coming out is a little bit smaller than a millimeter in diameter, and we need roughly 2 to 3 millimeters in order to get through the double slit in a uniform way. So it was a nice beam divergence method, and it also looked nice. So here again, we have a slightly different task. The task in the previous experiments was we instruct you what to do. Whether you're ready for it or not, now do this and now do that. So we changed it this time so that people were allowed to intervene with the system whenever they wanted to. It's like if you felt you're ready to concentrate, you press a button. 10 seconds later, you actually would get the instruction, okay, now concentrate. But it gave you a little bit of time whenever you feel like you're ready, go, get ready, get ready, get ready, and now concentrate. So what you're seeing here then is where the finger is pointing is somebody has pressed the button, and they know 10 seconds later they have to concentrate. So they have this 10-second warm-up period. And we expected a delay even after they start to concentrate because the task is slightly different. And so we're down almost at 3 sigma drop. And this is how many people? This is 20 sessions, each person spending about 25 minutes doing the task, and each one has to press the button 30 times. So 30 trials in one given session. So there's the result. Again, we got a drop in the double slit power as we predicted. And there's exactly the same system under control conditions, and none of that is statistically significant. In the same paper, we also presented a third result, which is using the helium neon system online. And this was done to make a very rigorous test of the possibility that are we dealing with some sort of an artifact due to the proximity of the person or not. So in this case, the closest participant in this experiment was 4 kilometers away, and the farthest participant was 18,000 kilometers away. So nobody is close to the system. It's in the lab. It's only accessible over the internet. These are locations around the world where people had done this experiment. Our lab is where the check mark is, and the 18,000 kilometers is South Africa. That's the farthest away. The way it works is you have a server that somebody, a human or a robot system. We have a Linux robot act as a simulated human for our control task here. So if a human comes in, they go to the commercial server, and we have about 5,000 sessions from humans, 6,000 sessions from our robot. They go to the server, it connects to the server that is connected to the double slit, and it starts feeding data to their web browser. And so the nice thing about this design is that the double slit system and the server that is dealing with the data, it doesn't know whether a human has asked for data or whether a robot has asked for data. So we have very, very nice control here because the system is just, all it does is push out bits, pushes out data actually, and it doesn't know where it's coming from or who's requesting the data. It's always exactly the same. When a human does the experiment, they see 2 screens. These are in Flash, and they see it in their browser. If they're given the instruction to relax, they just see a blue screen and there's nothing happening. If they see the instruction or they hear the instruction, now please concentrate, they see a squiggly line. They're told to try to make the squiggly line go up. And there's also a tone that sounds like a whistling wind. So the whistle, you try to get the whistling wind to go up in pitch, and it kind of goes along with this moving line. So you could do this experiment with your eyes closed, because you don't have to look at the line, you can just listen to the pitch. It lasts for 11 minutes. And we have checks in there to make sure that the person's still doing the experiment, because if we don't get a proper handshake back from the person's computer, then we know that they've stopped the experiment. And so we end it at that point. So again, given instructions to now concentrate your attention on the system, make the squiggly line move up, or relax and do nothing. Here too, we expect a delay. but it's longer than a task switching delay. It's not simply 3 or 5 seconds, where we also have internet delays. We have a delay in terms of the feedback that we give people, because feedback is based on the last couple of seconds of data in order to give a smooth response. So we did some calculations and measurements, and we decided that the feedback delay, or the delay that we would expect in the data, would be roughly 5 to 10 seconds delay. Empirically, it turns out that 9 seconds is the optimal time. So there's instruction to concentrate, and when we delay the data a little bit because the reaction would be slowed. So here's what this interference pattern looks like. This one is a little bit rectangular, and we did a very simple analysis based on fringe visibility. This is simply looking at, for an adjacent peak and trough, it's the proportional heights. So in a perfect interference pattern, you have 100% fringe visibility. You have a very, very low trough and a very high peak. We looked at the middle 20 fringes in the interference pattern because those are the ones that are the most stable. We measure each fringe. And so here we're looking at the difference in fringe visibility during concentrating versus relaxing. The red line in the middle is a 2 sigma level. And as you see, some fringe number 9, which is more or less in the center of the interference pattern, actually went down to about 3.5 sigma drop. The interesting thing is that all 20 fringes are negative. They're predicted to be negative because we're basically saying that fringe visibility should drop. It should shrink when people are putting their mind in the box, and that is what we see. So fringe visibility declines when the mind focuses on the double slit. And it does not decrease when you have a simulated human do the same task. So again, the reason why this is so nice is because the double slit system has been sitting there now almost for 3 years. It's on continually. It has no idea who's asking for data. Sometimes it's humans on the other end, sometimes not. You get fringe visibility drop significantly when people are on the other end, and you don't when you have a Linux box. Now, for those of you who believe in the possibility of machine consciousness, we know at least that a Ubuntu box is not sufficiently conscious in order to make this thing work. So there are the human observers, there's the robot observers. This is a reminder for me that when you're doing something like this, where you have 20 fringes that are not completely independent of each other, you can do something called false discovery rate, which is like a Bonferroni correction to see how many of these drops are really statistically significant. So false discovery rate is used very often in EEG research, because if you're looking at electrodes and you want to know how many of the electrodes in a given area are significantly different, you need to adjust for the correlations. Well, you can do the same process here, and it turns out that of all of the 20 fringes, that in this case, there's something like 10 of the 20 fringes which are significantly dropped. So even though there are correlations here, they're still significant. Many of them. So what causes this change in the fringe visibility? Well, remember our model said that there's something like an asymmetry going on. It's as though the mind is causing the amount of light to go through one slit a little bit less than the other. So when somebody is asked to mentally observe, even from many, many kilometers away, maybe that's what's happening. So if you do a fringe visibility analysis, you can model that if you have perfect symmetry between one slit and the other, your fringes are there's the peak and there's the trough. So the trough is very close to 0, the peak is where it is, and now we've introduced a little asymmetry. The trough rises, but the peak stays the same. More asymmetry, trough rises, peak stays the same, and more, so on. So as you make more and more asymmetry, the trough is where the action is. The trough is rising and the peak stays the same. So let's look in our actual data to see what happened. The troughs rise and the peak stays the same. So this is, again, suggesting that one way to think about what's happening is it is as though the light becomes asymmetrical in the two slits, because the troughs are rising a lot, in this case over 5 sigma for the center fringe, but the peaks don't change at all. So all of those involve studies with continuous beam laser. If we think about the number of photons involved in this case, photons per second are many, many gazillion trillions of photons per second. You can actually calculate how many there are, but I don't remember. Just say many trillions of photons per second. So when the mind is doing this task, you don't have any possibility of capturing individual photons, even though that's the task. The task is to imagine you can gain which path information, but how can you gain which path information of a trillion things per second? So we decided to do this as a single photon double slit system to give the possibility that the mind actually might be able to capture what was going on. Remember, all of this is happening in your mind. It's imagination which is doing the capture, but nevertheless, at least you have the possibility of capturing something at a human scale rather than at a trillion photons per second scale. So this device you see on the right there with a little Buddha sitting on it, this is about a 1 meter long chamber, and the way that it's sitting on a vibration isolation table. It's a very heavy table that's sitting on pneumatic legs that is designed to dampen vibration. So it's a very stable system. This is a schematic of it. On the left, you have the source of the light. It's a very tiny little bulb, and you can tune it down so that the amount of light coming out of the bulb is very, very low. That goes through a very heavy green filter. The photons coming out are actually yellow. It's a yellow bulb. Goes through a green filter, and there are not very many yellow things that can get through green. So you end up with even fewer number of photons. Those go through a single slit to collimate them. And by the way, this is not a laser. This is just an incandescent bulb. So it goes through a single slit, then goes through a double slit, and then it goes on to another single slit that you can move on a stage and select which photons go into the photomultiplier tube, because we need to count each photon as it goes through now. The reason that you can move the stage is because you want to be able to check, is it actually producing an interference pattern one photon at a time? And then you have a digital counter that's simply counting the number of photons per second. So here you have on the vertical scale the number of photons per second. In this particular case is roughly 25 to 30 photons per second that's being counted. It's a very well-behaved system. It gives a nice Poisson distribution, as you would expect. And when you move the little stage around, you can see what are the number of photons that we're actually getting. Well, it ranges from around 25 up to around 700. And you can see the error bars there, and it actually is showing a very nice interference pattern, one photon at a time. So this is how you know that what's happening here is the wave property of light actually, it really does work. It's somehow the light's going through two slits at the same time. So the task now is you ask somebody to put their attention onto the system. We're going to look at a trough. We're going to look at that particular spot. And if the idea is that what's going on is collapse of the wave function, then we're going to get, by virtue of looking at the system, we will interfere with interference. In other words, we'll get rid of the interference, and we should increase the photon count rate. So now, rather than trying to drop a level, we're trying to raise the number of photons. That's the prediction. Again, we use a volitional task. We allow people to intervene in the system when they wish so that they're at an optimal attentional period. So they can relax as long as they want, then they press a button to do the task. They wait a couple of seconds, and then the computer says, now concentrate. They concentrate for 30 seconds, and then they go back to relaxing. So the first experiment we did, there's the mean for resting, for waiting, and concentrating. This is a 5 sigma drop. So this is opposite to our prediction. This does not show a collapse of the wave function. If anything, this is showing a sharpening of the fringes. Or another way of thinking of it is that the entire system becomes much more orderly, much better behaved. So we like this because when you get a 5 sigma anomaly, you can get the Nobel Prize if it happens to be the Higgs boson. In this case, we're pleased with that because it told us a clue that maybe our original concept was either incorrect or maybe something different is going on when you're using 1 trillion photons per second as compared to when you're using 25 or 30 per second. So we did now a sequence of experiments. I'm just going to mention a couple. So the second experiment we did, we got a 2.5 sigma rise. Now this was a different design, different people, a lot of things that were different in the experiment, but we're now thinking, well, we might be onto something, but we don't know what it is yet because we're flip-flopping from one to the other in statistically meaningful ways. In that experiment with the 2.5 sigma rise, we're also keeping track of the personality of the people involved in the experiment using the Cloninger inventory. And what we found is that the people in our experiment were very significantly deviant from the norm, in particular on the characteristic called self-transcendence. So these were the people who tend to end up in our experiments are interested in things like meditation and self-development and so on. So it's not too surprising, but as compared to the population norm, these are not normal people. Compared to the average person off the street in California, especially Northern California, they probably kind of look like this. We also were taking 32-channel EEG so we could look at brain response while they're doing the double slit task. And so here's pictures of many people that were involved in the experiment. And the upshot of this is that when they're concentrating, the double slit count went up. It didn't stay up for very long. It actually, over the course of the 25 seconds that they're concentrating, it went back down to chance pretty quickly. So even meditators doing this experiment could not maintain the kind of concentration that was necessary for more than around 5 seconds. But nicely, because we're looking at their EEG, we're able to measure alpha desynchronization in the brain, which is correlated with attention, with concentration in particular, and that drops. So we're getting a nice anti-correlation between alpha desynchronization and the result in the double slit. So the more you concentrate, the better the result in the experiment, which is nice. We also found, since we ran 20 participants, we're able to look on average what is happening in terms of different frequencies in the brain. And we found that one of the frequencies showed a significant result across all 20 people. And this is a directional correlation with gamma frequency. So this is not an increase in gamma in the temporal and the occipital, but actually a decrease in gamma. Gamma becomes desynchronized as well. So actually everything, alpha, beta, gamma, all of the brain frequencies become desynchronized in the process of doing this experiment. The bottom is showing, however, an absolute change. It doesn't matter whether the gamma went up or down, but it's just some change from a baseline, very significant results in the temporal area. This says that what we're seeing is not consistent across people. That some people, gamma went up, some people, gamma went down. We're thinking, okay, well, there's something going on with that particular frequency, which is much greater than any other frequency we saw, which is related to these results. So here we have our other cat. And this came about because we're trying to think now, what is it about doing this experiment with single photons, where sometimes you get a very strong result in one direction and sometimes a very strong result in the other direction? Doesn't seem to make sense until I started to realize that the quantum Zeno effect is one of the properties of what happens when you observe a quantum system. It doesn't work for all quantum systems because it needs to be in a certain configuration. But suitable quantum systems, when you look at it, they basically freeze. It freezes the evolution of the quantum system. That's the quantum Zeno effect. What I did not realize until I started looking into this is there is also a quantum anti-Zeno effect. And this is that you can look at certain systems and accelerate its evolution. So you can do both, and it depends a lot on the way that the system is devised. You can, depending on the frequency with which you observe the system, you can freeze it or you can accelerate it. So we've been doing experiments involving single quantum events with different designs. So maybe I thought, well, let's do an experiment where we do what amounts to a quantum Zeno experiment. So we used our diode laser. We set it up to get, this time looking at fringe visibility. And we're tracking fringe visibility in one particular fringe, and it's a very nice, well-behaved system. And the observer's task is that we're measuring 50 samples per second. We're getting fringe visibility out of the system 50 times a second, but sometimes we present it to people very, very slowly, like 1 out of every 200 samples. And then sometimes a little bit faster, like 1 out of every 50 samples, and then even faster. So there's 4 different levels of speed in this experiment. System just keeps pumping out data, but there's an observer of what's happening at different time scales. So this is the result. So you see 14 control sessions, 14 also with humans observing the system. The variance for the results with the humans is very statistically significant, and for the control it's not. So this is a suggestion that maybe what's going on here is that there are different modes of observation going on in the different experiments that we did, which we didn't even think of originally, which may be accounting for the fact that we're sometimes freezing the system and sometimes accelerating it, and that's why we're getting flip-flops. It is also the case that individuals observe in very different ways. And so even in the same exact experiment, you can have people doing something different in their head and ending up with different results because the nature of the observation is different. So what have we learned so far? We've learned that attention affects behavior of light in quantum optics systems. It's somewhat consistent with von Neumann's proposal, especially the ones involving continuous lasers, and also that some crazy ideas might be correct. So how does this particular crazy idea fit into the rest of science? Well, in the big jigsaw puzzle where we're trying to understand the universe, maybe three places. One is that it is psi-like. I mean, it's involving some kind of mind-matter interaction. It probably fits into this rising interest in information physics, and also probably with quantum biology. Like there's something about those three areas will probably fill in the jigsaw at some point. Maybe consciousness is fundamental, after all. And I'll end with acknowledging many fine collaborators who helped in this design and execution. And also this work, which could not have been done without our funders, the Biel Foundation in Portugal, Fetzer Memorial Trust in Michigan, Mental Insight Foundation in California, and the Federico and Elvia Fagin Foundation here in Silicon Valley. And with that, I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dean. It's fascinating. We will take a few questions.
Dean, regarding the observers themselves, is it the act of simply concentrating, or is it the act of concentrating specifically on the area where the slit is? Because I've noticed, I don't know if you're familiar with a new toy called the MindFlex, where you actually can change this little device based on whether you're concentrating or not, if your mind is just kind of, drifting. So did you try that to separate whether they're concentrating specifically on task or just concentrating?
That's a very good question, and actually it was addressed somewhat in the quantum Zeno experiment, because in that experiment the only instruction is look at the dots on the screen. And I mean, they knew that it had to do with a double slit, but I didn't say very much about it. So simply just pay attention to the fact that things are happening. So that's attention without any knowledge of the system. In all of the other systems, we did tell people what it's about. This is a double slit, and there's this theory, and so on. When you ask people after the experiment, what did you do? For about 20 seconds, they followed instructions, and then they found it was too difficult to do that. So they did a huge range of different kinds of strategies. So in that respect, it's kind of a miracle that the continuous laser experiments worked as well as it did. So maybe it doesn't matter, the exact form of concentration doesn't matter too much. And I think that is also now what we see in this quantum Zeno type of experiment, that it's more about observing that something is happening and not the details. And in particular, for people doing this over the web, they don't see anything about a double slit. They just see a squiggly line, and it works for them too.
So extending that point, we know that in psi experiments, our intention affects the outcome. How do you know that the outcome is being affected via the mechanisms that you're suggesting in terms of collapse of wave function? As you know, we've done experiments at the University of Colorado with intention on reflection of light, and we find that there is an effect on reflection of light. And moreover, the more lability we give to the system, the more noise there is in the system, the greater the effect. And so how do we know what part of it we're affecting?
I don't think there's a clear answer to that yet. I mean, in particular, because the delayed choice version of this worked, there's always the possibility that the analyst is collapsing the system backwards in time. So there are ways to get around that, of course. You have different analysts involved, and one of my hopes in this kind of experiment, since we've gotten such good and relatively consistently good results, is to inspire others to do something like it. Because that's really the only way of knowing whether it's an analyst effect, and eventually we'll get clever enough and figure out ways of answering that very important question. At this point, I don't know.
That's all the time we have for questions right now, but you may proceed to rush Dean with your myriad questions at the lunch break. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.